a mysterious person drew a circle around the farm. From that point on, no one could cross the line. If anyone stepped outside the circle, their flesh would rot away. The people on the farm were like bugs trapped in a teacup. Will the main characters find a way to break the curse and escape this mysterious circle? Welcome to the latest sci-fi series, Teacup. The film begins with a woman bound up, trying to use a stone to cut her bindings. She looks terrified, and suddenly freezes. But the woman quickly returned to normal. Suddenly, a dog barks behind her. The woman is startled and runs away. Meanwhile, on the other side of the forest, there is a tranquil estate. The lady of the house, Maggie, seems to have had a conflict with her mother-in-law. She suppresses her emotions and asks her husband James about the farm. From their conversation, it is clear that the animals on the farm have been in a state of agitation, as if they have been frightened. As a veterinarian, Maggie goes into the stable to check on them. The horses appear very restless. Meanwhile, her youngest son Oro saw a goat slip out of the farm, so he chased the goat into the forest. Unbeknownst to him, the strange woman from the beginning was watching him from the shadows. Maggie feels uneasy, and it isn't until evening that she realized her son is missing. After all, her eldest daughter and mother-in-law are at home, and she didn't think Oro would be in trouble. Maggie thinks her son is hiding in the closet and is waiting for a chance to scare everyone. Just then, a horn sounds from outside. The couple goes outside to check. It's the Reuben family who lives nearby. Their horses suddenly went wild, and one of them smashed its head and was bleeding. Maggie stepped forward to check the horse's condition. James sent their eldest daughter Mel to look for where Oro might be hiding. Upon hearing this, the grandmother went back to the room to look for him. Meanwhile, seeing that the situation was wrong, Maggie prepared to take the horse back to the clinic.
Why am I not seeing Arlo?
It's okay, Mom's got him.
No, she doesn't.
James had no choice but to split up with his daughter to search. Maggie took Reuben to tend to the injured horse. She quickly discovered a broken piece of wood sticking directly into the horse's neck. Maggie had to pull the wood out. She asked Reuben to hold the horse's head. Then Maggie pulled out the piece of wood. Fortunately, the wound was shallow, and there was no major bleeding. Reuben breathed a sigh of relief. Meanwhile, James couldn't find his son, but he was talking to Reuben's wife Aya. There seemed to be a secret between them. The next moment, Mel walked into the room and interrupted the strange atmosphere. Mel stated that she hadn't found her brother on the farm, but one of the goats was missing. Aya felt an ominous premonition upon hearing this. This morning, Donald from the village called to say that their pet dog was also missing, because that dog never left its owner. James noticed Mel's expression change, and quickly reassured his daughter not to worry. Perhaps Oro just went to chase the goat. He told Mel to take Aya's son Nicholas, and went into the woods to look for Oro. He would go around the front with Aya to search. They would meet in the middle. The scene shifted, and Oro was lost in the woods. He was cold and scared when he heard a goat bleeding. Oro was about to chase after it when he noticed a strange woman behind him. She kept muttering murderer. Then the woman lunged at Oro. Not long after, Mel and Nicholas arrived nearby. The boy, looking envious, said, "You have a great family." But Mel clearly didn't think so. Her father was always busy, and Maggie was more competent as a veterinarian than as a mother. As for the grandmother, she had to rely on medication for pain relief due to multiple sclerosis. Such a family couldn't be called great. Just then, the two heard strange noises from the darkness. They hadn't realized the seriousness of the situation. As for the male head of the household, James, he cared even less about his son being missing, because long before Oro was born, his eldest daughter Mel had gone missing once. Maggie and he searched every corner of the house, but they found no trace of their daughter. Maggie was almost in despair at that time. Mel had been hiding in the oven. It turned out the girl was obsessed with Hansel and Gretel. She wanted to imitate the witch in the story and bake herself. After the girl crawled into the oven, the door accidentally closed. Mel couldn't push the oven door open from the inside. She fell asleep, so James just thought that Oro had done something foolish. He wouldn't just disappear for no reason. Just as he finished speaking, Nicholas came over with a dog. It was Donald's pet dog. Mel was also carrying the missing goat. James hadn't had time to ask more questions when a shadow flashed through the woods. Feeling uneasy, he called everyone to head back inside. Meanwhile, Oro collapsed on the ground. That strange woman lay in front of his face. She opened her mouth in a bizarre way. Maggie saw her husband running back to the farm, and learned that they hadn't found Oro. James rushed into the farmhouse to search for tools. He planned to return to the forest to continue searching. Upon hearing about the pet dog, the Donald family rushed over immediately. Maggie saw her husband holding a baseball bat, and felt uneasy. James explained that the shadow in the woods might be a wolf. He wanted to go back to confirm. However, Donald said it wasn't a wolf, but a dog, and that it might have rabies. It would growl and bark at the sight of people. As Donald spoke, he took a shotgun out of his car. James felt it was unnecessary to use a gun. Donald didn't understand this at all. If my son ran into a woods with rabid dogs, I wouldn't just use a gun. I'd use a cannon if I had to. Just as the two were arguing about this, Oro returned, looking disheveled. His arms were covered in scratches.
Who did this to you?
Let's go, wasp. And strange murder maker. Entiendo.
Oro kept repeating mysterious phrases, and then he collapsed into Maggie's arms. Meanwhile, the strange woman in the woods let out a weak cry for help. Immediately, she was knocked down by that dog. Soon, a car broke the silence of the night. A masked figure got out of the vehicle. He was holding a paint spray gun, and began to draw circles around the edge of the farm. He watched the James family from the shadows, but at this moment, Oro was unconscious, and no one noticed this unexpected visitor. Everyone was preparing to call an ambulance, but there was no signal on their phones. James ran into the garage to start the car, only to find that the car wouldn't start at a critical moment. Reuben also jumped into his car, and he discovered that his car wouldn't start either. Finally, it was Donald's turn to test his vehicle. As expected, all the cars on the scene had failed. The next moment, the lights went out completely, and the farm was plunged into darkness. Maggie sensed that something was wrong, and decided to take Oro inside first. No matter who had scratched the boy, that person must still be hiding nearby. Everyone brought Oro into the house, and Donald's dog kept barking frantically. James asked Reuben to prepare the saddles for the horses, and the two planned to ride to get Aya's car. Suddenly, Donald headed toward the woods with his gun. He intended to deal with the person who hurt Oro. Donald's wife Claire tried to stop him but couldn't. She could only watch her husband walk into the woods. At this time, Maggie was checking her son, and found nothing wrong. The blood on her hands wasn't Oro's. Mel complained that her brother was too naughty. Aya couldn't help but comment, "You weren't any better when you were little. You hid in the oven and caused trouble." Maggie's expression changed slightly upon hearing this. Only the family knew about this incident. It must have been her husband who told Aya. Maggie tried to shake off these thoughts, and asked everyone in the room to leave. Maggie asked her son privately what exactly happened in the woods, but Oro seemed to not remember what had happened earlier. He suddenly became serious and said, "We have to leave here immediately." Then he began to repeat those phrases again. Oro pushed past Maggie, ready to run away. In the process, he also knocked down Nicholas. Maggie caught up to him, and held on to Oro. Nicholas' head was bleeding from the impact. Mel took him to tend to his wounds first. Meanwhile, James and Reuben prepared the saddles for the horses. The two really couldn't understand how the person who hurt Oro managed to disable all three cars. As they were speculating wildly, they suddenly saw a car with its lights on ahead. The two ran over to take a look. The masked figure saw them approaching in the rearview mirror, and surprisingly got out of the car holding a board. The masked figure raised a hand to signal them to stop. Then he pointed to the paint line on the ground. The masked figure raised the whiteboard in his hand. It read, "Don't cross the line." James found it absurd. He explained that his son was injured, and he needed to borrow a working car. Unexpectedly, the masked figure suddenly drew a handgun. James hurriedly raised his hands, and stepped back. The scene shifted back to the farm, where Maggie was tending to her son's wounds, but Oro picked up a pair of scissors, and lunged at her.
I'm not gonna let you leave again.
Run, hide. Woman, go.
Maggie snatched the scissors away, and held her son tightly. Oro quickly returned to normal. He wasn't sure what had happened. Oro only felt fear in his heart. Maggie comforted her son, telling him not to worry. "Everyone gets scared. Your sister once hid in the oven, and I still feel scared when I think about it."
How scared were you?
I was so scared that I made your dad promise to never tell anyone about it.
From this passage, it's evident that James and Aya have an unusual relationship. Plus the previous hints, it's very likely that they had an affair. On the other side, Donald was patrolling the woods. He speculated that Oro might be possessed by Satan, which is why he was saying strange things. The next moment, Donald was tripped. He awkwardly got back to his feet, Donald saw the strange woman lying on the ground, unresponsive, and the big black dog was nearby, sniffing the shotgun on the ground. Donald broke out in a cold sweat. He gestured to calm the vicious dog. Donald stood up straight and backed away. He quickly ran over to James. The big black dog was still chasing him. He was about to get bitten on the rear. Donald hurriedly squeezed through the fence, but the black dog suddenly lunged at him, grabbing onto his arm, and not letting go. James and the others saw how intense the situation was, and were too afraid to step forward. Fortunately, Donald was tough enough. He directly threw the dog out. Once the dog left the paint circle, its flesh began to peel away. In an instant, it turned into a pile of bones. It turned out that the masked figure's warning not to cross the line was not a meaningless prank. He held up the whiteboard again. This time it read, "Don't trust anyone." The masked figure quickly returned to his car and left the farm, leaving the three of them stunned in place. Meanwhile, after hearing the gunfire, Claire couldn't sit still any longer. She prepared to take her pet dog home and called the police using the landline. Then Claire planned to drive over to take Oro to the hospital. She left, holding onto her pet dog. Aya hurriedly handed her a flashlight. Donald saw his wife approaching with the light, and the three of them shouted as they ran over, trying to stop her from crossing the line. But the pet dog suddenly broke free from its leash and ran away. Claire hurried after it. Donald reached out to pull her back, but half of his forearm decayed instantly. Claire exploded right before his eyes, and her whole body rapidly deteriorated. The people on the farm were like bugs trapped in a teacup, unable to escape the blue circle at all. Oro seemed to know some kind of clue, but couldn't express it clearly.
He says we need to hide.
Who says?
The man in my head.
Oro told his mother that it was coming. It would kill everything in its way. No matter how terrible the events of last night were, the farm welcomed a new day. Donald kept vigil by his wife's body all night. Maggie and her husband also spent the night awake. They had too many questions in their hearts. James planned to search around the farm to see how large the area of the line was. Unfortunately, their conversation woke Reuben. Before they could greet him, they heard their names being called. Maggie wanted her husband to take Reuben along, but James was somewhat dissatisfied. Upon hearing this, Maggie stopped pretending. "I know you have a connection with Reuben's wife, which is why you don't want to include him." At this point, James had to explain that his relationship with Aya was over. It had been a mistake made in a moment of impulse. Reuben then realized he had been cheated on. Though being betrayed by his partner hurt him deeply, but there were more important matters to address. Reuben told Maggie that he was willing to accompany James to scout the area. Reuben also handed Maggie a shotgun. After all, the children were at home. Maggie needed a weapon to protect everyone. After saying this, Reuben went to find James. He made an effort to maintain his composure and only discuss serious matters. According to the mysterious masked figure from last night, the blue paint line formed a circle. The two planned to find Edward, who lived nearby, to see which side of the circle his house was on. Meanwhile, Maggie helped Donald into the house, as his arm's decay needed attention. Grandma and Aya took a blanket to cover Claire's body. At this moment, Maggie injected Donald with painkillers, so he could rest on the bed for a while. Unexpectedly, Donald suddenly remembered something. There was another body in the woods last night, the one who had abducted Oro. The scene shifted to Oro, who was looking through a dictionary in his room. He was like a child just starting to learn how to read.
Harbinger.
Harbinger, that's you?
The boy claimed he was the pioneer. He was learning human language through the dictionary. Meanwhile, Oro's consciousness was in a dormant state, because the pioneer had a limited vocabulary. He could only repeatedly say two words, hide and die. This meant that they either had to hide, or they would die. Just as he finished speaking, Mel accidentally knocked over a cup, and the water soaked the crayon drawing. The pioneer seemed to have thought of a way to break the situation. He took a glass jar from the cabinet, and wanted to take Mel with him to the woods, but the girl didn't dare to trust this so-called pioneer. Unexpectedly, Oro's consciousness suddenly awakened.
Harbinger is real, Meryl. And he's telling the truth. We need to go right now.
Go where?
Oro explained that the pioneer was hiding in his mind out of fear. "I am your brother, and the only one who knows the truth. I need you to believe me unconditionally." Mel could only go along with him. The three of them arrived at a nearby forest. Deep in the woods, there was surprisingly a meteorite crater. Inside lay several animal corpses. It turned out that those animals that ran into the woods were affected by this meteorite crater. The pioneer raised his hand and made a descending motion. indicating that it was the extraterrestrial object. The pioneer moved some stones from the bottom of the crater and poured the colorful liquid into the glass jar. Then he explained that this liquid contained toxins.
So what are we gonna do with it?
We drink it.
Meanwhile, James and his companion arrived at the edge of the circle. A snake attempting to cross the boundary had its head corroded off. Nearby, crows were circling low in the sky. These birds love to eat carrion. Their presence indicated that there were bodies nearby. The two immediately headed to Edward's residence. To their surprise, his house was also inside the circle. James called out Edward's name loudly, but there was no response. The two decided to search the entire farm separately, and James quickly found a female officer's corpse by the plastic pool. Next to her lay a sheet of instructions for rescuing drowning victims. Not far away, a mask was discarded. James heard the cawing of crows behind him. He turned to see yet another corpse. James picked up the shotgun from the ground and walked into a side room, not expecting to find another male corpse inside. He went around the partition and saw that the dark basement door was open. Just as James was about to step inside to check, he was dragged down by a pair of hands. Soon after, James woke from his unconsciousness. He realized his hands were bound with straps. A man was striking a match in the shadows. He weakly removed his gas mask and seemed unsure whether James was an enemy or a friend.
Basically, I'm gonna need you to give me one really good reason why I shouldn't finish this cigarette and shoot you in the fucking head.
On the other side, Reuben saw several puppies squatting in front of the barn. He shooed the dogs away and opened the door. What he found inside shocked Reuben greatly. An alien plant was growing wildly. Reuben stared ahead, his dilated pupils reflecting an eerie glow. At the same time, Maggie learned that there was another corpse in the woods. She immediately went to check with her shotgun. Maggie found the strange woman. There were marks of restraints on the woman's wrist. At this moment, almost everyone in the house had run into the woods. Only Grandma and Aya were sitting in the yard, chatting. Unexpectedly, a car suddenly drove up. The two of them immediately smiled. A bearded man got out of the car. He ignored the objections and stepped into the blue circle, but he showed no adverse reactions at all. The bearded man stated that he was here to safely take everyone out. However, he wanted to understand the specifics first, such as how many people were on the farm, and what each person's occupation was, etc. Just as Maggie returned from the woods, she saw a stranger in the yard. Aya introduced him as Lieutenant Olson, who had cooperation with the Birmingham police. He came to this small town, originally to capture and isolate a woman named Carmen. And this Carmen was the strange woman, who had died tragically in the woods. This person's disappearance and abnormality are related to the appearance of the blue circle. Maggie explained that when Donald saw Carmen, she was already dead. I also saw her body in the woods just now. Olson breathed a sigh of relief upon hearing this. Fortunately, you didn't come into contact with a living Carmen. Otherwise, that would have been a big problem. Grandma felt uneasy upon hearing this. She wondered if Oro had encountered Carmen, since he had been in the woods for so long. Olson then requested to see Oro. Maggie felt that this man was untrustworthy, so she falsely claimed that the children were in the barn. I can take you there to check. Maggie led Olson into the barn. She asked him what the line actually was. Olson stated that it was a very intense and concentrated form of vibration. When complex biological entities come into contact with it, there will be tragic consequences. As for the principle of this resonance, Olson was unsure. He only knew that it would interfere with signals and currents. Upon hearing this, Maggie changed the subject and asked, "Did Carmen suffer any abuse in her life? Because I saw the marks of strangulation on her hands." Olson explained, "I received this assignment after Carmen went missing, so I am not familiar with the circumstances before her escape." Olson didn't want to continue chatting. He asked where Oro was. Maggie pointed to the attic. As the two climbed the stairs, Maggie raised her shotgun. She wouldn't let anyone hurt Oro. Maggie knocked Olson unconscious and tied him up in the attic. She instructed Aya to keep an eye on him. Olson noticed that this woman was not as resolute as Maggie.
Maggie's right to be worried about her son. But if you don't cut me loose right now, things are gonna...
Aya asked Grandma to help keep an eye on Olson. She was going to the forest to find Nicholas. Olson noticed that the old woman's hands were twitching. This was a sign of multiple sclerosis. At this moment, his eyes throbbed painfully from the blood, so he asked Grandma to help wipe it away. The old woman suspected nothing. She walked over to clean the blood. Suddenly, Olson opened his mouth wide. Colorful patterns slid across his pupils, instantly entering Grandma's body. The trembling hands of the old woman quickly regained their health. Meanwhile, Olsen seemed to have lost his recent memories. He repeatedly asked, "Where did McNab go? What happened to Travis?" Possessed Grandma raised the gun and shot the man dead. Then she cut the bindings, and Grandma forcefully slammed into the nearby pillar. She fabricated the illusion of self-defense and murder after being injured. The scene shifted back to the meteorite crater. According to the Pioneer, the liquid in the jar was toxic, but as long as the dosage consumed was controlled, it could safely cross the blue line. Of course, if you drink too much, you would end up poisoned and die like the animals in the crater. The most dangerous part was that, if you took the conservative route, choosing not to drink and stay within the circle, there would also be something called the assassin that would break in and kill. In short, whether you drink or not, there is danger. Mel heard this and wanted to talk to Oro. The Pioneer could only release the boy's consciousness. From the conversation between Mel and her brother, it was clear that the Pioneer did indeed come from outer space, and the assassin created this unbreakable line precisely to trap it. The assassin wanted to stop the Pioneer from completing its mission. Just as Mel was about to ask what the mission was, a car engine suddenly roared in the distance. The three quickly ran over to check the situation. The masked figure stood outside the circle holding a sign. It still read the phrase, "Don't cross the line," but he soon saw the glass jar that Nicholas was holding. The masked figure immediately wiped off the original writing, gesturing for the three to throw the jar to him. Mel and Nicholas refused to hand over the jar. Unexpectedly, the masked figure stepped directly into the circle. He was trying to seize the jar. In their struggle, the jar was shattered. Nicholas even stabbed the masked figure in the abdomen. The figure pulled out the knife and tossed it aside. Mel, influenced by her mother, removed his mask to perform first aid. The man stared at Oro. He recognized that the entity from Carmen's body had already entered the boy's body.
I was trying to help you. Almost got you to the car. We were almost safe.
From the conversation between the two, it was clear that this man was the McNab that Olsen had mentioned. At this moment, Reuben uncontrollably reached for the large tree. A spider suddenly dropped down, and in the blink of an eye, it was sucked against the trunk and killed. Reuben realized that there was something wrong with this tree. He wanted to run, but the barn door was already blocked by branches. At the same time, James was also grappling with the stranger. Dean, unable to tell friend from foe, and almost killed James. Fortunately, he mentioned the strange circle on the farm, and a strange man in a mask. Upon hearing this, Dean calmed down and said, "If you know McNab, you will know the truth of the matter." Dean was originally the bartender at the local bar. One day, he unexpectedly encountered a customer named McNab. He always sat at the bar, telling mysterious stories about aliens, and claimed that they were hiding among humans. The people at the bar often took the opportunity to mock McNab, but he would roll up his sleeves and revealed arms covered in scars. He explained that this was the consequence of touching alien traps. The bar owner, seeing that McNab was drunk, asked Dean to drive the customer home. On the way, he couldn't help but ask McNab, "Do you know how that invisible alien trap works?" McNab said that its source of power was a colorful tree. That tree would attract people close, like the song of a siren, and then blow up those who approached. Perhaps others would only take McNab's words as nonsense. For some reason, Dean felt inclined to believe him, so he began to seek out McNab for conversations frequently, and as a result, learned a lot of information about aliens. For example, they have no physical form, so they don't travel in spaceships, but instead hide on meteorites that fall to Earth, and then look for opportunities to inhabit humans. The human body is like a house to aliens, which they can switch out at any time. Moreover, these extraterrestrial visitors can be both good and bad. When good aliens land, the bad ones will come to hunt them down. Dean didn't understand why he knew so much insider information. Just as he finished speaking, a pickup truck drove up. The Lieutenant Olsen from earlier got out of the vehicle. It turned out that he and McNab were both responsible for hunting down extraterrestrial visitors, affiliated with a certain joint special unit. Seeing Dean's interest in aliens, McNab wanted to recruit Dean into the organization. So McNab trained Dean with Olsen, and assigned him his first mission to capture the police officer, who was parasitized by the bad aliens. The organization had been secretly monitoring her for 2 years, until 2 weeks ago, the police officer suddenly became very active. This indicated that the good aliens were about to arrive. They needed to closely monitor news about the officer. This mission seemed simple, but was actually difficult, because the aliens could escape at any moment. Bullets wouldn't kill them. As McNab spoke, he began to recount a past incident. 10 years ago, his daughter Alyssa went for a walk in the woods. She was possessed by a good alien. McNab didn't understand why his daughter's personality changed so drastically. He wanted to call for help, not realizing that the bad aliens had already set a trap. His phone lost signal. Soon after, a bad alien possessed a medical worker. Under the pretense of treatment, they fed Alyssa a colorful liquid, and he had also taken a few sips. Then he dragged Alyssa out of the house. At that time, no one had drawn a circle to warn McNab of where the trap was, so when he tried to follow the two, his arms were almost completely corroded. Fortunately, McNab reacted quickly and stopped in time. He felt a barrier surrounding the house. A few days later, the invisible barrier disappeared. McNab discovered his daughter's corpse not far away. The alien inside her had already been removed. McNab had taken this path to avenge his daughter. McNab handed Dean a bottle of colorful liquid to prevent him from getting trapped by the aliens. The next day, the three secretly followed the police officer. She released a black dog. Then the officer entered the farm where Edward lived. McNab saw Edward's mother looking exhausted. He knew she had been possessed by an alien. The officer's purpose was to kill her. The three donned their masks and began to act. Since Dean was the newcomer, McNab instructed him to set up a pool in the yard, which might be needed later. Then he and Olsen charged into the house. Not long after Dean found the water pipe, he heard gunshots coming from inside. It turned out that the female officer had killed Edward, and then walked into the adjacent barn. She had a gunshot wound on her shoulder. The female officer opened her backpack and poured the entire bottle of liquid onto the ground. Meanwhile, McNab was escorting Edward's mother out. She suddenly broke free and ran toward the woods. Edward's mother was the strange woman seen at the beginning of the film. McNab originally intended to chase after her, but he saw the death tree rising from the ground. This indicated that the trap was about to be set. McNab hurriedly got in the car and left. Dean immediately called him. The phone suddenly lost signal and emitted a harsh malfunction sound. Then the bad alien came into the yard. Since the officer wouldn't survive long after being shot, it took the opportunity to enter Dean's body. Unexpectedly, when the officer's consciousness awakened, she actually shot and injured Dean, yet he seemed to feel no pain. At this moment, Olsen rushed out of the cabin. He came over to check on Dean. After seeing he was injured, Olsen even took off his mask. Little did he know that the next second, Dean opened his mouth, and the alien inside him transferred to Olsen. Awakened, Dean hid in the basement. The rest of the story was easy to guess. The good alien inside Edward's mother had transferred to Oro. So Olsen, possessed by the bad alien, would chase after James's house. Now, Dean had lost too much blood, and he couldn't last much longer. Dean directly ended his own life. James seized the opportunity to escape the basement. He ran to the barn to rescue Reuben. As soon as James opened the door, he saw the colorful branches, and quickly closed the door. Then James used an axe to break open the wall to rescue Reuben. The two immediately mounted their horses and rushed back to the farm. However, they encountered Oro along the way, as well as the severely injured McNab. Meanwhile, Maggie was bandaging her grandmother. She didn't know that the person had already been possessed. The bad alien wanted to transfer to Maggie. Aya suddenly ran in, saying that they were back. Maggie hurried outside to greet her family. Nicholas told his parents that they had found a colorful liquid. As long as you took a sip, you could get out of the strange circle. Unfortunately, they had accidentally broken it earlier. Reuben thought there might still be some remnants. He asked his son to take him to the scene to take a look. Maggie was busy performing first aid on McNab. Donald led James to the attic to see Olsen's body. The bad alien assassin inside him had already transferred to another person, and Grandma was the prime suspect. The scene shifted. Reuben's family arrived in the woods. They indeed found some liquid remnants. He stared blankly at the broken glass bottle. Reuben couldn't help but remember the tree in the barn. Just then, a wild wolf appeared. Reuben urged his son to shoot quickly. However, Nicholas hesitated and didn't dare to act. Just as he made up his mind to pull the trigger, the wolf had already licked up the liquid and run away, safely crossing the strange circle. As they felt frustrated, Nicholas saw a notebook on the ground. It contained information about aliens that McNab had recorded. Meanwhile, Maggie had finished treating McNab's wounds, and learned from Mel that an alien called the Prophet was hiding inside her son, and it was on a specific mission. Maggie asked her son about the details of the mission. Oro replied that the Prophet wanted to find a machine, and that it must not alert the lurking assassin.
And this machine, what happens when you go to it?
I am the on switch.
What happens when you turn it on?
The invasion.
McNab was uncertain how many assassins were here, and the Prophet was humanity's only hope to resist the invasion, so he wanted to take Oro with him. Just as he finished speaking, James rushed over to stop him. He urged McNab to calm down. James wanted the Prophet to transfer into his body. He would take his son's place as a hostage. McNab certainly wouldn't waste any time. Unexpectedly, Donald suddenly burst in. Startled, McNab pulled the trigger. James took the opportunity to rush over and knock the gun away. McNab could only flee, but Donald was wearing a bulletproof vest, so he was not injured by the bullet. Now, Grandma, possessed by the assassin, was missing. James told Maggie to take care of their son. He and Ruben's family searched everywhere. Maggie worried about Oro and wanted the Prophet to transfer into her body, but Oro immediately rejected this, because Maggie had the ability to protect others. She needed to stay alert. In contrast, Oro had no ability to protect others. Even if he temporarily lost self-awareness, it was fine. Just as Maggie was feeling distressed, Nicholas suddenly came in with the notebook and said he had made a significant discovery. Before Nicholas could finish speaking, a noise came from outside. Maggie told the children to stay in the bedroom. She cautiously went out to check. Meanwhile, Ruben and Aya were searching around. They arrived near the garage. Ruben entered the garage to assess the situation, but there was nothing inside. However, a shadow flashed behind Aya. At the same time, James was also searching cautiously. Strange noises kept coming from the door. He nervously pulled open the door. Donald's pet dog rushed over. Just when everyone had found nothing, Donald found Grandma on the farm. Moreover, her fingers, which had been twitching, had returned to normal.
I don't know where it went, but it's not in my head.
That said, everyone was hesitant to fully trust it. What's more troubling is that, if Grandma isn't lying, then the assassin could be on anyone present. For now, they could only temporarily isolate Oro, except for Mel and Nicholas. No one else could approach the bedroom, because only the two children had not been alone, and they hadn't had the chance to be possessed. Nicholas finally found an opportunity to speak up, although he didn't have a way to discern who was possessed, but he found a method in the notebook to separate the assassin from the body.
How?
We drowned them.
No wonder McNab had previously instructed Dean to prepare a pool and printed out the steps for drowning rescue. Meanwhile, McNab headed to Edward's house. He walked into the basement and found Dean's corpse. McNab took the small bottle from Dean's neck, which still contained a small amount of colorful liquid. At this moment, everyone on the farm was feeling uneasy. They had to restrain and suspect one another. While waiting for the assassin to reveal a flaw, Nicholas stood guard in front of Oro's door with a hammer. Several men gathered in the yard to start a fire. They wanted to see if the thick smoke could signal for help. However, this was a farm, and people often burned leaves here, so the chances of attracting outsiders were slim. Ruben didn't want to waste time around the fire. He walked away. Donald instructed James to keep an eye on the fire. He quickened his pace to catch up with Ruben. Maggie took the opportunity to approach her husband for a talk. She handed the drowning rescue steps to James. The last item on it read, "Check for vital signs." This meant that if they used the drowning method to separate the assassin, the possessed person might actually die. Mel, like her parents, was also very concerned about this. Nicholas wanted to comfort her. He said there were successful precedents in the notebook. In Maine, a person who was possessed drowned and went into shock was rescued and regained control of their body. Moreover, Nicholas had read that drowning feels much like falling asleep, with little pain felt.
You know who wrote that? Someone who's never drowned.
Ruben went back to the garage and poured a bucket of gasoline. He was preparing to go to Edward's house to destroy that tree. Donald couldn't stop him and could only follow. Ruben poured gasoline in a circle around the barn. He warned Donald not to look inside. That strange tree could confuse people's minds. He was determined to light a match and throw it. The fire immediately engulfed the entire barn. The tree burned black along with the wooden structure. Just then, McNab suddenly appeared. He said this wouldn't work, but I have other viable methods. Meanwhile, Mel saw that her brother had drawn a lot of doodles. He said these were clues for finding the machine. She carefully examined the patterns and found they resembled a map. So Mel pulled out a map to compare. To her surprise, one of the outlines matched perfectly. They were now located in Atlanta, Georgia, and the end point of Oro's drawn route pointed to Belknap Mountain. Outside, Aya came over to find Nicholas.
You don't not anymore.
Why not?
Because I know who Assassin is.
As Mel walked out of the room with the map, Nicholas was already nowhere to be found. He was pulled by his mother to a corner of the yard. Aya took out a vial of tranquilizer and said she found it in Grandma's room. She must have wanted to use this to trap the prophet. This meant that Grandma was lying. Nicholas was about to ask his mother what to do, but she suddenly opened her mouth wide. The assassin inside her entered Nicholas's body. Awakened Aya didn't have time to react before she was pushed out of the circle by Nicholas. In an instant, she turned into a pile of bones. The latter picked up the tranquilizer and left. Over by the barn, McNab handed the colorful solution to Reuben. Reuben took it and drank it. Then he took a deep breath and walked toward the strange tree. McNab put on thick gloves and began to break the branches. Reuben endured the intense burning pain and tossed the branch into the glass jar. To his surprise, it instantly turned into a pool of colorful substance. This would be enough for everyone to successfully cross the strange circle. While progress was being made on various fronts, James and his wife were having a conversation. The sudden upheaval and death made them finally willing to speak their true feelings. They expressed their thoughts and difficulties to each other. They both wanted to save their marriage. Just then, Nicholas, who was possessed, suddenly threw a stone at the bedroom window. He waved to Mel, signaling her to come downstairs. The girl, not suspecting anything because she liked him, asked her brother to lock the door before going down. Nicholas said, "My mom is the assassin. She just tried to grab me, but I managed to escape." To make his lie sound more believable, he also took out the tranquilizer and said, "This was taken from my mom." As he spoke, he picked up a stone from the ground and placed it beside him. Then Nicholas hugged Mel's head and burrowed in, hiding behind the window. Oro saw everything that had just happened. He immediately pushed open the door to find his parents and said, "Mel has turned into the assassin now." Maggie quickly took her son and hid. When Mel went upstairs, she found that the people were gone. She walked to the window and saw Grandma with Oro, so Mel hurried downstairs to chase after them. Unexpectedly, she was intercepted by Maggie halfway. The assassin held a knife to her throat, forcing Maggie to back away. Maggie couldn't joke about her daughter's life, so she had to put down her gun and compromise. The next second, James lunged in for a surprise attack. He was wearing a gas mask, which could prevent him from being possessed by the assassin. James restrained Mel, and Maggie quickly put on her mask. The two of them struggled with the frantic Mel and carried her into the bathroom. They personally pressed their daughter into the tub filled with water, but Maggie quickly gave up. After all, this was her daughter, whom she had carried for 10 months. What if she really died in the bathtub? However, for the greater good, the couple could only harden their hearts and restrain Mel until their daughter no longer struggled. They quickly pulled Mel out and began to perform first aid. James seemed unable to bear leaving the bathroom, and Maggie has been providing first aid all along. She finally brought her daughter back. Meanwhile, Reuben and the others returned with their spoils. He encountered Nicholas, who was waking up. On the way, Reuben's memory was still stuck at the moment he went downstairs with his mother, completely unaware of what had happened afterward. At this moment, Grandma was waving to Oro from a distance. The group gathered in the garage. Grandma explained that James and Maggie had captured the murderer Mel and were now inside with her. Reuben realized that Aya was missing, but Grandma didn't know where she was either. The situation was urgent, and they couldn't delay. Since they had this bottle of colorful liquid, the Prophet and McNab needed to head to Belknap Mountain as soon as possible. Reuben asked Nicholas and Donald to accompany them on their mission. He went to find James and the others, and find a way to locate his wife Aya. Everyone would meet at Belknap Mountain. As the group just left the garage, they saw Aya's body in a horrific state. At the same time, Maggie led her daughter out of the bathroom. She noticed that James was acting strangely. Maggie had a bad feeling about the situation. She suspected that the assassin had transferred to her husband. Maggie immediately grabbed the gun from the table. James shouted, "Run!" Upon hearing this, Maggie grabbed her daughter and left. Meanwhile, Oro seemed to sense something. He suddenly broke away from the crowd and ran off alone. As James left the room, he saw that the garage door was open, so James walked in with a knife to check. Unexpectedly, Reuben lunged at him for a surprise attack. James quickly subdued him in response. He held Reuben's head and slammed it to the ground. Fortunately, Maggie arrived just in time to fire her gun and stop him. Immediately, they heard Oro's voice from outside. James immediately abandoned Reuben and ran outside. Oro ran into a side barn. Maggie raised her gun to stop James from following, but she didn't have the courage to shoot her husband. As James rushed into the barn, Maggie hurriedly asked her daughter for the tranquilizer. At this moment, James climbed up to the loft he finally found Oro. Before James could act, he was stabbed by Maggie. She quickly led Oro downstairs.
Remember the wasp? What? The wasp in the teacup.
It turned out that Oro had come up with a solution. They didn't need to kill the assassin, and just needed to trap the assassin like catching a wasp in a teacup. That would be enough to contain the assassin. Maggie injected the tranquilizer into James. Then she shoved him into the fridge behind her. Reuben came over to help after hearing the shouts. Mel couldn't bear to see James injured. If this continued, Dad would suffocate to death. But James had to serve as the teacup. Only by sacrificing him could they trap the assassin. Gradually, there was no more movement from the fridge. Afterward, everyone shared the colorful liquid. One by one, they stepped out of the strange circle. Grandma volunteered to stay behind, to take care of the pet dog. The group was very quiet on the way. Unexpectedly, after the car has driven for a few kilometers, they suddenly encountered two strangers.
Who here is McNab?
The newcomers were Carol and Milo. They belonged to the same organization as McNab. They had been communicating online, but they had never met each other before. Carol seemed to have something to give McNab. She bent down to rummage through her backpack. Suddenly, a car rushed over and killed Carol and Milo. A man and a woman got out of the car. The man opened Carol's backpack and found it filled with zip ties and tranquilizers. The woman in the car warned the main group. Carol and Milo were not allies. The assassins had already awakened. They were now everywhere. You can only survive by following me, if you want to have a chance to live.
We're not going anywhere until you tell us what the fuck is going on.
The story of this season ends here. This series is adapted from the novel Stinger, by author Robert McCammon. In fact, a single movie could convey the themes that the 8 episodes aimed to express. Overall, the opening suspense was quite engaging. Each of the mysteries was also captivating. The middle episodes gradually revealed and filled in the gaps. The logic was also coherent. The latter half focused on the trust games between people, finally found hope, and encountered another crisis. This set the stage for the next season. In general, it was quite standard, but just for not leaving big plot holes, it already surpasses many convoluted sci-fi series. If you enjoy my channel, please click to subscribe.